All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we were getting set up. This is always a little bit of a challenge to coordinate the webinar. We're excited to have you. This is the second session of our second webinar. So, ambassadors, today you're going to hear from Michelle Breslauer, who is our Director of IEP's Americas Program. She's going to give us an overview of the 2007 Global Peace Index, point to some key findings, and also some key messaging that will be useful for all of you. As with the first webinar, if you have questions about the content, you can type them into the chat box, and we'll address them at the end. Thank you again for being with us, and I'll give it over to Michelle.
Good morning, ambassadors. It's about 10 a.m. here in New York City, where Lori and I are based. So good morning or good evening to all of you, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us for the second webinar in our series this year. Last time you heard from two of our researchers, Talia Haggerty and Tom Morgan, about the methodology of the Global Peace Index. So they talked a lot about the technical issues that we are facing, how a composite index is constructed, what an index can and can't do, and what the various indicators are that make up IEP's Global Peace Index, what the sources are, and what some of the definitions are. I'm going to pause for a minute and just make sure everybody can hear me, as I'm seeing a few questions come through the chat box about whether or not the meeting has started. Can somebody please type in 1 if they hear me? Okay, great. So we just have a few ambassadors that are still logging on. Thank you guys so much for your patience. So as I mentioned last time, you heard much more about the technical aspects of the Global Peace Index and the methodology behind it, how we construct it. I also want to remind you that this information is available in the Global Peace Index report. The methodology section is quite detailed by indicator, but we've also been getting a lot of different questions from ambassadors over the past week around some of the issues that they're interested in, some of the ways they might want to collaborate, and also additional questions. We are trying to get back to each and every one of you. If we have not yet responded, don't worry, we did receive your question and we will get back to you. And we really do encourage this back and forth. It's a great opportunity not only for you, but also for our research team and for our outreach teams to hear how people are interacting with the data and with the material. And I think that is one of our greatest challenges, of course, is that we're trying to put out complex data in a simple, more comprehensible manner around topics that can be sensitive or tricky. And so trying to translate that is always quite difficult. We do get a lot of questions around the methodology, the use, and other elements of the index. And if we haven't been able to answer your questions in the webinar, we will be compiling them and circulating a frequently asked questions document to you soon. So in the next couple of weeks, you can expect that. Today, what I'm planning to do is to go through a presentation of the findings from the 2017 Global Peace Index. This was released in June of 2017. And I'll take you through some of the narratives, findings, and ways that I might present this information. We will be providing you with a template PowerPoint and script around the launch of the 2018 Global Peace Index, which will happen in June. So those slides will be different from the ones that I'm presenting today. today is to give you a better sense of how we communicate some of this material. So I think the first major question is really to go through how we define peace for measurement. And this is something you heard about last time, but it really is important to clarify the conceptual foundations of the different work that we're using. So let's start with the definition of peace used in this research. Now, many of you are familiar with Johan Galtung, who's a Norwegian sociologist and who's often referred to as the father of peace studies. And he defined two concepts of peace, negative and positive peace. Negative peace is the conceptual foundation of the Global Peace Index, and the definition that we're using for the Global Peace Index is the absence of violence and the absence of fear of violence. Now, this definition goes beyond thinking about the absence of interstate violence or wars, but also about the absence of violence that affects the way people live their lives. This means that the definition takes into account more than just the security of states, but also interpersonal security. But negative peace doesn't tell you anything about what is necessary for a peaceful society. However, positive peace refers to the attitudes, institutions, and structures that lead to mutual cooperation and benefit and help society move away from violence. Another way that we can frame this is that negative peace is capturing what we don't want, while positive peace is much more about measuring what we do want. And the way that IEP approaches positive peace is through the statistical analysis of the attitudes, institutions, and structures that are associated with violence or negative peace. So the primary piece of research is the Global Peace Index, which is probably the core research product of IEP. And the Global Peace Index, to be very clear, is a measure of negative peace. It's of the absence of violence or the absence of the fear of violence. The 11th edition of the Global Peace Index was released in June, and it's a ranking of 163 countries and territories according to their relative states of peace. And this allows an assessment of peace on a continuum. Countries can be very peaceful, moderately peaceful, and not very peaceful. Now, this is important to shift our focus away from the dichotomy of bad and good or rich and poor to something that all nations can aspire to improve. It brings it into a much more universal context. The Global Peace Index is a composite index, meaning that it brings together many factors to present one single number. And it uses 23 indicators that are each weighted on a scale of 1, most peaceful, to 5, least peaceful. The index is developed by the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's guided and overseen by a panel of experts, and it includes data collected and collated by the Economist Intelligence Unit. And this allows us to have peer review embedded into the index construction and analysis. So what we're aiming to do is provide a more holistic measure of peace. And so what are the indicators that make up the Global Peace Index? And these are the indicators that all of you went through in much more detail on the previous webinar. But of the 23 measures, they can be broadly categorized in 3 groupings: ongoing domestic and international conflict, societal safety and security, and militarization. And here are just a few examples, ranging from the intensity of organized internal conflict to the impact of terrorism to military expenditure. And so what I think is important to point out here also is that the Global Peace Index takes into account both external and internal factors. So we're looking both within and outside of a country, but the internal factors have a greater impact on the final score. And this was the result of a decision by the expert panel at the outset of the index that peace is felt first at home. Now, this data is sourced from a range of international organizations, including the International Institute of Strategic Studies, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, various UN entities, and peace institutes. And since this includes both quantitative and qualitative indicators, we look to country analysts from the Economist Intelligence Unit to provide a score for the qualitative indicators. So this means really that they're using their significant knowledge of a particular country to estimate how it would score in certain areas. And those scores are all reviewed. Now, once all this data is brought together, countries are scored on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being the most peaceful and 5 being the least peaceful. Now, remember that the rankings are relative. So a country may change in the rankings one year, but it could be due to the fact that another country either improved or deteriorated. They're relative, and no country is completely at peace, and no country is completely unpeaceful. It's looking at peace on that continuum. And so when we bring all of this data together, we get this map of the state of global peacefulness. And so this is what the map looks like from the 2017 Global Peace Index. And it reflects data from March 2016 to March 2017. Countries that are in orange and red are less peaceful than countries in yellow and green. And I just want to highlight a couple of things as we're looking at this map. I'm not going to go through individual country scores today. I might mention some examples, and there are certainly many more details in the report and on the website. You can access all of the information by country on our website. So if you go through, you can click into a country, you can see how it's scored and ranked over the 11 years of the index, as well as look at the individual indicators, compare countries, or change the map based on indicators only. So that information is there. And I encourage you to be creative when you're thinking about how you're presenting this material, because we're also very happy to help you with information and analysis around particular countries so that you can craft a presentation that may speak more directly to the audience that you're presenting to. I'm just going to go through some very top-level findings today. But a few other things when we look at this map. Note there can be great regional differentiation. Also remember that the rankings themselves mean less than the actual scores. And another thing I want to point out, because I think that it does speak to a lot of the questions that we tend to get, is that remember that the Global Peace Index is measuring negative peace. So this is the measure of the absence of violence or the absence of the fear of violence. But it's also looking at the outcomes. What this is not reflecting are the inputs. So we're seeing what the state of peace is. We see the level of homicides or military expenditures, not what went into them. We see the numbers of conflicts or deaths from conflicts, not the political processes behind those conflicts. So I just want to make that clear, because I think we tend to get a lot of questions that wrap up the findings of the index and the analysis with the more qualitative assessments that would need to happen after the fact. So when we look at some of the highlights from the 2017 index, what have we found? Overall, we actually saw a slight improvement in peace in the 2017 index. So it was at 0.28%. But despite this slight improvement, the world has still become less peaceful over the last decade, and I'll go through the 10-year trends in a moment. And what's been driving this is that 68 countries deteriorated while 93 countries became more peaceful. So we saw more countries become peaceful than deteriorated, and this led to the improvement. We've seen an increase in peace inequality. So we often talk about income inequality, but now we're also seeing an increase in peace inequality, with most countries having only small increases in peacefulness, while a handful of countries have had very large deteriorations in peace. We're seeing the gap between the most peaceful and least peaceful countries widen. The indicator with the largest improvement was the number, duration, and role in external conflicts. And this was mainly due to many countries winding down their involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while in most cases the withdrawal of troops occurred some years ago, the indicator is lagging in order to capture the lingering effect of conflict. Now, the indicator measuring political terror also significantly improved in all regions except for sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa. And there were also general reductions in the number of homicides and the level of violent crime. But just to pull out some of this idea of peace and equality, we're seeing these divergent trends around the world. So one example of this inequality is seen in levels of political terror. Political terror is around state-sponsored terror, extrajudicial killings, and it's improved globally, but it's declined in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa regions. And so despite the fact that we've seen notable political violence in countries such as the Philippines, Burundi, and Turkey, many more countries improved on the indicator measuring political terror. 42% of countries in the political terror index improved on the extent of state-sponsored violence and terror, the levels of imprisonment without trial, the extent of political suppression, extrajudicial killings, and torture. And this is mainly the result of recent developments in convictions for crimes against humanity and other past human rights violations, which indicates declining impunity for government and military members in certain countries, including Argentina, Peru, Chile, Cambodia, and Costa Rica. We've also seen improvements in the indicator measuring homicide, signaling that rates of everyday interpersonal violence are improving. And given that homicide still accounts for the great majority of lethal violent death, this is a profoundly positive development. And I'm pointing out some of these specifics because I actually think they're quite interesting. Once you dig in to some of the data of the index, and we don't have the capacity each year to do extensive analysis on every trend or indicator, you can see some results that might counteract common public perceptions, that may present a different story, or that may trigger thinking about what types of progress are slow moving, but are not always taken into account. And I think that the example of political terror is quite interesting because we tend to see media reports of what's happening, but not media reports of the slow process of trying to account for past crimes, for instance, and what impact that can have. So just to continue through the country, some of the country level findings, Syria remains the world's least peaceful nation. It's fallen 64 places since the index began, and this is the largest decline of any country in the index. Excuse me. Now, we've seen Syria undergo years of civil war, which has displaced millions of people and left most of the population in poverty and in need of humanitarian assistance. More than 60% of the population is displaced, and there's been over 500,000 people killed. And this has had a dramatic impact not only within the country, but on neighboring countries and around the world. Conversely, Iceland remains the most peaceful country, which is a position it has held since 2008. And when we think about Iceland, we like to bring up this one fact just to illustrate some of the difference between Iceland and some of the countries that are less peaceful in the index. And one example is that if we look at Iceland and the UK, December 2013 was the first time in modern history that a citizen has been killed by police fire in Iceland, which is obviously a radically different situation than here in the United States. Europe remains the most peaceful region in the world, with 8 of the 10 most peaceful countries coming from this region. However, while 21 of the 34 countries of the Europe region improved, the average peace score did not change notably, and this was due to substantial deteriorations in Turkey, the impact of terrorist attacks in Belgium and France, and deteriorating relations between Russia and its Nordic neighbors. North America as a region, which in this index is composed of the United States and Canada, had the largest deterioration. And that was due completely to the fact that the United States fell 11 places in the index this year due to rising homicide rates, increasing perceptions of criminality, and the intensity of internal conflicts driven by political polarization. Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa followed in terms of deteriorations. Now, when we take a look at the 10-year trends, I think we have some more robust results to point to because the 10-year trends are really quite interesting. And what we're seeing is that over the last decade, peace has declined by a little bit over 2%. And this was driven by the fact that 83 countries became less peaceful, while 80 countries became more peaceful. However, that deterioration has been dominated by conflicts in the Middle East. So if we were to actually remove the region of the Middle East and North Africa from the index, the world would have become more peaceful over the last 10 years. And if we look at some of the factors that have been leading to this, we see that over around a decade period, the deaths from internal conflict have increased almost 700%. We've seen deaths from terrorism increase almost 250%, and the number of displaced people has doubled. However, there have been some positive, noteworthy developments over 10 years. So at the global level, homicide rates have improved in 67% of countries, and the level of political terror has been improving over the last 10 years. On average, the level of militarization has improved, and that continues a much longer-term trend of the major powers decreasing military spending and might. And now one of the key messages that we always want to put forth as well is that these levels of violence are costly. And IEP works to try to frame some of our expenditures on containing and dealing with the consequences of violence as an industry. So each year we produce an estimate of the global cost of violence, adding up the costs associated with containing, preventing, and dealing with the consequences of violence. And for that, we look at 16 different dimensions, and the figure is enormous. So in the 2017 Global Peace Index, we published the figure of $14.3 trillion as the economic impact of violence. And that's equivalent to 12.6% of world GDP, which is roughly equivalent to almost $2,000 for every person in the world globally. On average, violence accounts for 37% of GDP in the 10 least peaceful countries, compared to only 3% for the 10 most peaceful. And once again, just to highlight that this is still a very conservative estimate, because there are a number of measures that we can't include. For instance, a variety of measures around private security funding. And the importance of comparing this to an industry, of presenting this as an industry, is that we want to be able to think about the expenditures on violence and the expenditures on trying to prevent violence in the same approach of cost-benefit analysis that we approach other industries like healthcare or education. And we want to try to frame for the public and for policymakers how economically unproductive and costly violence can be, because we know that conflict has a deep and long-lasting economic impact, not just social impact. So when we're trying to make this information clearer to people, we do include these comparisons. So a 1% reduction in the cost of violence is equivalent to all of global foreign aid from 2016, just a 1% reduction. 10% reduction in the cost of violence is equivalent to all of global total foreign direct investment, or the total economies of Denmark, Switzerland, and Belgium. So it's a massive, massive figure. And despite how large this figure is, we're still spending comparatively a fraction on peace building and peacekeeping efforts. Now, peacekeeping really is around post-conflict, but peace building comes from the prevention side, and peace building is less than 1% of our cost of conflict. And this is a really striking comparison, and it suggests a serious underinvestment and reinforces the point that the world is spending a lot on violence and very little on building peace. And we started to take this analysis a step further. We have a separate report that came out last year that's trying to take a cost-benefit approach to investments in peace-building efforts. And so we took as a case study Rwanda. Now, there are a lot of assumptions built in to this model and to this case study, but it's meant to be illustrative. So if we look at 20 years of expenditure, peace-building expenditure in Rwanda, and we assume effectiveness, we can see that for every $1 spent on peace building, it's reducing the cost of conflict by $16 in the longer term. Now, clearly, not every expenditure will be effective, but the main point is that the cost of conflict is so great that even if activities in countries at risk were successful only 50% of the time, only half the time, there would still be a 5 times return on that investment. And there are other effects from those investments as well, such as investing in stronger institutions. And so some of these messages that we're seeing from the research is that the last decade has seen a historic decline in world peace, and we're seeing a continuation of longer-term trends in peacefulness that goes away from external conflicts between states and towards internal conflicts within states. We're seeing increasing levels of inequality in global peace. And this is concerning because the countries that are becoming less peaceful are also the countries where there are growing urban populations, for instance, located in fragile urban areas. We spend a lot on violence and very little on building peace. And we need to shift the focus to positive peace. Our interventions are not creating more peace, and we need to invest in prevention and building resilience. So that leads us to trying to understand, well, what is it that creates peace? It's not enough to look at the risks of violence or the absence of violence. We also have to look at what builds more peaceful societies and how to invest in long-term prevention efforts. And this helps us understand how conflict is mitigated in a non-violent manner so that increases in violence do not spiral into atrocities. And we know that we must understand how to move towards greater prevention efforts so that societies can achieve a level of resilience that doesn't allow them to fall into vicious cycles of conflict. But understanding those factors is obviously a huge effort, and it's understudied. But this is what brings us to IEP's framework around positive peace. And so I mentioned that positive peace is derived through statistical analysis. And so what we've done is that we've taken the Global Peace Index measures over many years of negative peace, and we've compared them to thousands of data sets, indices, and attitudinal surveys at the global level to try to understand from an empirical perspective the attitudes and institutions that are associated with violence or negative peace. So to do that, we analyzed over 8,500 variables that broadly covered macroeconomy, social relations and attitudes, economic and social development, economic and social integration, the functioning and structure of government, and external relations. And the result is an 8-part framework of interrelated factors that contribute to positive peace. And they include a well-functioning government, which is broadly measuring government effectiveness, effective judicial systems, and the extent to which citizens are allowed to have a voice in decision-making. A sound business environment, which refers to the economic framework for business set by government, the presence of supporting infrastructure such as internet access, business sophistication, and overall market conditions. The equitable distribution of resources, which is more than a reflection of income. It also is about how vital services and goods such as land, water, education, healthcare, and justice are distributed throughout a society. The acceptance of the rights of others, or the level of tolerance and acceptance afforded to individuals in a society. Good relations with neighbors, which describes a country's capacity to use diplomacy to manage disagreements and to positively manage relationships with other countries. The free flow of information, or how easily citizens can gain access to information and whether the media is free and independent. High levels of human capital, which are defined as a country's stock of skills, knowledge, and behaviors, and this includes education and youth development. And low levels of corruption, which is the extent to which corruption is prevented or individuals and organizations are held accountable when corruption occurs. And why do we think of positive peace as being a transformational concept? Now, positive peace is about the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. It's not all-encompassing. It is at a macro level, and it's a broad framework to look globally. It does need to be grounded at the national or community level. And it might manifest differently or have different elements as well at those levels. But it provides this frame to address what creates and sustains peaceful societies rather than what are the risks of violence and conflict. It's different because it's been empirically derived, and it reframes the study of peace towards what works. Now, we take a look at our measures of positive peace, and we try to compare it to other data sets to really understand if it's being held up. And we see that positive peace is also a measure of societal resilience. So countries with high levels of positive peace tend to be more resilient to external shocks and tend to more often than not resolve conflicts in a nonviolent manner. Finally, positive peace creates an environment that leads to many other positive outcomes, such as higher levels of GDP, human development, gender equality, and environmental sustainability. Now, what I'm showing you are a few outcomes of that research, where we see that positive peace, countries with higher levels of positive peace have shown the least change in their scores in the Global Peace Index, meaning that those countries have been more stable. They also, over about the period of a decade, have had higher GDP growth than countries that have deteriorated. In fact, we've seen almost a 2% higher GDP growth in countries that have higher levels of positive peace. Finally, we see that countries that are low in positive peace tend to be those countries in which more political and violent endogenous shocks have occurred. So what you're looking at in this chart is that you can see genocide onset, violent conflict onset, political shock onset. 84% of those political and violent shocks have occurred in countries with lower levels of positive peace. So if we can better measure those, we can start to look for signs of early warning as well. And then we can also look to strengthening levels of positive peace in terms of prevention. Now, this is a lot of data that we work with, and our task then is to figure out how to communicate this data to a broad audience in order to shift the common perception of peace. And remember that we're operating at a global level. So one of the ways that we address this is to put resources into media outreach and to try to publicize the index and the research. In 2017, our media reach was over 3 billion people, and that's across the Global Peace Index and the Global Terrorism Index. The website that presents data in interactive maps drew over 5.5 million page views from people in 18,000 cities and more countries than there are UN member states. And then we look to policy, where our definitions of negative and positive peace have helped frame the Sustainable Development Goals and the inclusion of Goal 16 on peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. We've also participated in the expert reference group for the New Deal for Fragile States and the peace building and state building goals. I'm highlighting some of these examples because what the contribution of IEP has been is that we did start measuring peace with all of its imperfections, but it's helped show that this is something that can be done, that we shouldn't discount peace in the way that we approach development planning, expenditures, peace building goals, this is something that needs to be taken into account because the link between peace and development is too strong. And it can be measured and included. And so the definitions, the fact that the Global Peace Index exists, have all been helpful, not only in the advocacy of groups towards those different policy and legislative goals, but also towards proving that this is something that we can address the same way we're looking at some of the other areas of sustainable development that may be more straightforward. We work with national governments. Now, this is something where IEP does not have a formal department that works with national governments, but we do receive requests from governments to talk through their rankings, the way that they score on various indicators, and how to work towards better improvements in peace. We've seen this work cited in legislation here in the United States in the Cost of War Act and Defense Authorization Act. There was a new bill on fragility and violence reduction that was introduced to the United States Congress just a couple of weeks ago, where the first line references the global cost of violence. And the recently released Youth, Peace, and Security report at the United Nations, which was a Secretary General report, is highlighting some figures from IEP on how many youth worldwide are in areas of conflict and violence. But beyond this broader approach to policy and influence, we're also trying to take the work down to a more local level. And so we're really working with the Positive Peace Framework to go into various communities or countries and to have that framework used as the basis for workshops where participants are discussing how those 8 pillars that I went through might manifest in their particular communities, and also what types of actions and information can they now use to work towards greater levels of positive peace. And something that I want to point out about these workshops is that IEP does not have the answer, nor do we believe that there is one answer. What we want to do is provide the positive peace framework and any associated measures as a way to stimulate the conversation, not only around those 8 pillars, but how they interact, with the goal of trying to influence the way that people think about how they can shift their system. So is the national system or their community system or local system seeing improvements or deteriorations in positive peace? Are people understanding that there are links and relationships between corruption, the business environment, and the free flow of information? Do people see the way that they interact in a peace system and their role in it? And that type of thinking is one of the ways that we're trying to change people's perspectives as well. And part of that is to say, violence is not just an issue to be dealt with from a security perspective. We need to build these more peaceful structures to deal with it. Of course, since we are primarily a research institution, our research is used in hundreds of academic courses worldwide. It's been the basis for an annual graduate level course at New York University and at King's College in London. We do run regular academic conferences on the business and economics of peace, as well as on positive peace. And we've seen the Global Peace Index referenced in thousands of books. So I'm going to take a moment to stop here and let you all type your questions into the chat box on the side. So we'll give you just about a minute or so to start doing that, and then we can answer some questions. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the questions that you've been putting in. And as usual, we get a lot of great and interesting questions. So I'll try to address some of those now. The first question is about the fact that we pointed out that if we remove the region of the Middle East and North Africa, the world would have become more peaceful in the past decade. And the question is that considering that Western countries are heavily involved in the wars in the Middle East, doesn't this fall in the indicators? Is the fact that a country is at war, even in a foreign territory, taken into account? And the answer is two-part. One, yes, that is absolutely taken into account. When we look at the indicators that measure a country's role, duration, and extent in a conflict, whether it's internal or external, that indicator is capturing that fact. The United States, for instance, its score is impacted by its involvement in wars outside of its own borders. Now, what I will say is that obviously covert operations, proxy elements are not always captured through this data. But I want to maybe explain why I pointed out the fact that that region was impacting the 10-year trends so significantly. And that's because the broader point is not to be talking about the blame of the fact that these indicators are being so heavily impacted through wars in the Middle East. It's to point out that the levels of instability and violence have fallen into such protracted conflict in certain countries in this region, such as Syria and Libya, that it's having that dramatic of an impact on the index and on the world. And so what this is really meant to do is hopefully draw our attention to the fact that we don't want to be in this situation, that these are issues that we need to address earlier on if possible, and that the ramifications of these types of conflicts are broad and have a broad impact. So the next question is, will IEP develop a policy branch or liaison to outward-facing consultations should governments ask for that? And I'm not sure. I think the way that we are currently organized and established is as a small research institution. And what we're trying to do is to put forth these regular measurements and analysis that can be broadly helpful. I think to have the capacity to really work with governments on action platforms and on policies would involve building up an entirely new sector of IEP, and I don't know if we want to be there yet. It's certainly something that we've considered, but right now we want to keep the research more independent if possible and to provide it more regularly and globally. I think one way that we do want to think about how this research can be used or can be furthered is the creation of national peace indices. So many of you know that we produce an annual Mexico Peace Index. This is one of our core national peace indices, and we've produced that index for 5 years now. The 5th edition will come out in April. And what that index does is it measures peace across the 32 states of Mexico according to 5 internal indicators. We also look at positive peace in Mexico, as well as the economic impact of violence. Now that program obviously is much more domestically focused. We work internally with policymakers in Mexico, and we have a greater policy presence, I would say, there in Mexico. At the same time, we do need to balance that with the information that we're putting forward, because we need to put it forward in a way that it's still heard and accessed by people on every end of the political spectrum. Now, that's something that we'd like to try to replicate in many other countries. We received funding to produce the Mexico Peace Index, and so we do need funding to do that in other countries, and that is one of the key barriers to just scaling at that level. But just to think about that as a model of how we may choose to expand this research. The next question is, what happens with those countries whose official data, which would be helpful for IEP, is not released periodically? And that's a really good question because I think it points to some of the challenges of developing indices, but also highlights how much work goes into the index and the fact that it's not just as simple as adding up a bunch of data sets. So that's one of the reasons that we work with the Economist Intelligence Unit and with their country analysts and with their data analytics team, because they have the capacity and resources to try to estimate for certain data sets that may not have been updated, and then we can impute data. And so different methodological techniques are used to try to impute the data to provide estimates when there are data gaps. And I will clarify also that one of the strengths of an index that's constructed this way is that because the indicators have different weightings and there's many different indicators that are going into the final score, that some of those gaps are balanced out. No one indicator is going to drive the score. So we can have a little bit of balance where there may be gaps or not. And I will also say that this is not a perfect representation, nor will it ever be a perfect representation for each country. This is indicating the state of peace in 163 countries and territories around the world. So there's a question on what has been the perception and reception of presenting peace as an industry, i.e. from the business community or others. And I think it's been very attractive to certain elements of the corporate world. There is the question that comes up of the strength and of the military-industrial complex or of the violence industry. But the reason that we try to take this approach is to counteract some of those narratives. And we're not in any way saying that there aren't people that profit in violence, but what we're trying to put forward is the fact that there are actually a significant amount of people who profit from peace. And maybe if we start to think about that in a more cohesive, comprehensive manner, then we can counteract the idea that we can only think of the military-industrial complex or the violence industry. Now, in various different contexts, this type of data is used for businesses that are thinking about how they can be proactive about their efforts to improve peace. I think right now we are at the point where we want to provide the information to make them think about the impact of peace on their profit margins as a way to add incentive for them to think about greater peace building efforts. So there's a question of whether IEP ambassadors will be provided with material, information, or slides about IEP's work with SDG Goal 16. The answer is we can certainly provide you with that information. What we've done with Goal 16 has been twofold. One is I participated in global consultations and discussions, and one of my colleagues on the expert panel for the thematic review in the lead up to the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's been an outreach aspect. We also then have been measuring Goal 16 for the past couple of years. So we put out an annual progress report trying to understand really a data audit of what data is there to measure Goal 16 and what we can learn from these measures to date. And then finally, we're also involved with the SDG 16 Data Initiative, which is a grouping of organizations such as IEP, Transparency International, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, International IDEA, Small Arms Surveys, and other big global data collectors who are trying to offer a third-party monitoring of Goal 16 as well. And so what we can do is send around those resources around Goal 16. So Lori and Mike will send that to the group. And then we can also include a couple of slides around this when we send you the PowerPoint template. Sorry, one moment, everybody. I'm just going through some of these questions. There's a question about the Rwandan case study and the assumptions that were made about the success of peace-building expenditures in that context, asking for some clarification. Now, I think it's important to highlight or to qualify the fact that that was an exercise in trying to think about how we can develop methodologies to assess cost effectiveness of peace-building efforts. But it's a little bit putting the cart before the horse, which is an American expression, saying we did step 2 before step 1, in the sense that we still, as an international community, need to establish if peace-building efforts themselves are effective, if peace-building programs are effective, and if so, which ones are effective. Now, every social situation is different. There's not going to be one model that is effective everywhere. But there's very little research on the effectiveness of peace-building and prevention efforts. As you can imagine, it's very difficult to show that something that didn't happen would have happened. In fact, there was a study from DFID from the UK that I'm not remembering the exact figure off the top of my head, but it did a literature review trying to assess what literature pointed out the effectiveness of some of these prevention efforts and finding that there's almost no evidence base around effectiveness. So that's a major area actually for this community that we're all trying to look at. What types of best practices could we collect, for instance? So for Rwanda, the most major assumption was that peace-building efforts were effective in Rwanda. We saw levels of peace in Rwanda vastly improve. Now, there are internal dynamics. There are many challenges you can make to this argument, but that was the key assumption. So for the sake of this exercise, we had to assume that the Rwandan case study we chose was an example of effective peace building. So there's a question on how we can foster more data collection, systematization, and publication to increase the knowledge and accuracy of measuring peace efforts at subnational levels. It's a tricky question because it involves funding, it involves manpower, But I think that we do hope that people will, and this is one of the roles of the ambassadors, take some of these frameworks and measures into their own local areas and think about not only how the framework applies, but where the measures may be strong or weak. And one of the ways that positive peace can be addressed is through thinking about greater data collection. So perhaps it's around creating mechanisms for people to participate more. Maybe it's around surveys or apps that allow them to have greater participation that can also build trust. There are various ways at the local levels to think about participation, and the Positive Peace Framework aims to be one way to do that in a manner in which you can take those 8 pillars and try to think about mapping the current actions, and that's much more from a policy level that exists or programmatic level across each one of those pillars. Somebody's asking about the presentations that we're asking all of you as ambassadors to do. And he's asked, can I make a specific part about my country, using some of the 23 indicators as examples? And the answer is absolutely. We will provide you with a template of PowerPoint slides as well as a script. That doesn't mean that you need to follow that exactly. It's meant for you to be able to create your own presentation from. I encourage everybody to look at their own country and assess some of the indicators and some of the movements. In the map that you see online, you can actually go back in time and see how the country has changed on the index over the 10 years. And what I think is interesting here is also the fact that one of the key elements of an index that's a great opportunity is that it starts a conversation. And so I've been working with IEP for 7 years now. I've given many presentations to many different audiences. And whether or not people agree with the placement of their country on the index, they are always very curious where their country is ranked. It draws attention, and they will want to discuss why. And that's really an excellent opportunity. It's something that we should value, because stimulating that conversation is extremely important as we're thinking about trying to change this perception of peacefulness. And so I do encourage you to present your individual country's score and ranking and the indicators that make that up, even for the sake of starting a discussion. So we have a couple questions that I'm going to group together that are around policy impact and whether or not we work on the causal impact of policies, as well as whether we've done policy analysis to try to understand which policies have had a positive impact. And another question that is addressing what policies we would suggest. And the reason that I'm grouping it together is because I have one answer for that, and that's pointing to something that I said at the outset of this presentation, which is that the Global Peace Index is really trying to take this macro snapshot of the global state of peacefulness. So we're working at a broad cross-country comparative level. And the index itself does not reflect the actions of certain policies. We are very careful not to attribute changes in a country's score across different indicators to specific policies for a variety of reasons. One, methodologically, there are some flaws there. So we talked a little bit about imputing data, estimating some of the data. It's incorrect to try to take one policy and say, well, this policy has led directly to this improvement. It will ignore other factors. So we are very careful not to try to uphold, let's say, one government policy as the right one. Secondly, we don't have the qualitative analytical capacity to be doing policy analysis at that level. And it's a conscious decision that we've made at IEP right now to put our resources into providing these metrics and allowing other institutions or individuals to use that as the basis for their own policy analysis. So at the broad level, we can talk about influencing policy by having these figures quoted, by having some of these findings drive advocacy for certain different policies, or for something like acknowledging the intersection of peace and development, acknowledging that peace should be a goal, but we're not working within national governments to say X, Y, and Z policies are the right ones. So I think that we're going to aggregate these additional questions. We'll get back to you in writing with frequently asked questions. Don't hesitate to email us at the ambassador email if you have any more. And just to give you a sense moving forward of what to expect, we will be organizing the third webinar in this series for mid-April. So I believe April 16th and 17th are the dates set for that. And during that webinar, we're going to hear more about resources that are available to you that you can leverage for your work as ambassadors, for your presentations. And this includes hearing from Rotary International about their global grant structure and about how to contact various Rotary clubs. We'll also hear from the One Young World Network about some of their work and opportunities, as well as from some current and former ambassadors who will share some of the things that they're doing to translate some of this peace research. We have a couple of big indices coming up and coming out soon. I mentioned that the Mexico Peace Index will be released, the 5th edition, on April 10th. We'll have events in Mexico City, in San Diego, and Washington, D.C. around that in April. And then we'll offer ambassadors a separate webinar if you wish to hear more about that index and that work. On June 6th, we'll release the 12th Annual Global Peace Index, and we'll be sending you not only scripts and slides that you can use, but we'll also organize a webinar to take you through the latest findings from the index, and we'll be able to then answer questions about the 2018 index on that webinar as well. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for your rich questions, and please do stay in touch.